In this video, I'll present information from Chapter 13 of Human Anatomy and Physiology, 11th edition. This chapter focuses on the peripheral nervous system. And in particular, I'd like to present information about reflex arcs. Not only the components of the arcs, but also being able to distinguish between autonomic and somatic reflexes. So let's get started with two types of reflex. The one we mainly think about are these inborn or intrinsic reflexes. These are rapid and predictable motor responses to a stimulus. So they're very quick, they always look the same, they're not learned, they're involuntary. An example would be the patellar reflex. So if someone hits you in just the right spot, on your knee, your leg will kick, and it will kick in a predictable way. But it can also refer to things like adjustments in posture, so maybe the wind's blowing hard, you have to adjust which muscles are tense, which are loose, and control of visceral activity. So, food hits the intestines, they get triggered to start moving in a way that moves the food through your digestive tract. So those are inborn or intrinsic reflexes. And we also have learned or acquired reflexes. And the difference here is in the name. So whereas intrinsic were not learned, they were involuntary, learned are going to be learned. So you acquired them at some point. That means that they result from practice and repetition. So you just practice things over and over and over again, and eventually they become reflexive. They become things you don't have to think about. Examples would be bike riding and driving skills. So one thing also to note about these learned or acquired reflexes is that they're often much more complex than inborn reflexes. So these are things, say, like driving. You are having to use your hands in a very particular manner. Your feet, your eyes, your ears, every part of your body is basically engaged to do this very complex task. But in the end, you don't really have to think about it much. It's reflexive. So we'll focus mainly on this inborn or intrinsic reflex type, but just know they both work in very similar ways, just the learned are often much more complex. So let's look. If you're looking at a reflex, this is going to happen because of a reflex arc. And there are 5 essential components of a reflex arc. We're going to start at a receptor. So this is where the stimulus acts. So in this case, it looks like, oh my goodness, this person has been stuck with a needle. So there is a receptor that is detecting that stimulus. That receptor is then going to create a receptor potential. And that receptor potential is going to excite a sensory neuron. And if the sensory neuron is excited enough, it will then fire action potentials, which will travel all the way back to the CNS. In the CNS, it will hit an integration center. For this very simple reflex shown, the integration center is basically just one interneuron. And that integration center is basically going to take this input as well as others potentially and make an output. And so it will also get excited, and if it's excited enough, it will fire an action potential, which will then, in turn, excite a motor neuron. So when that motor neuron is excited, again, we get a graded potential that if it depolarizes enough, triggers an action potential, which now is going to travel through that motor neuron out to the 5th component of a reflex arc, which is the effector. And in this case, that's a muscle. So it looks like maybe you stepped on a pin and the signal gets sent back, processed by the interneuron, sent out through the motor neuron, and then the effector muscle causes you to pull your foot away from the stimulus, from this tack. In addition to thinking about those 5 essential components of every reflex arc, know that we can split reflex arcs into functional classes based on whether they are involving skeletal muscles or whether they are involving glands, cardiac muscle, or smooth muscle. So a somatic reflex is a reflex that involves skeletal muscle activation. And an example, again, would be that patellar reflex. An autonomic reflex is a reflex that involves glands, cardiac muscle, or smooth muscle activation. And an example would be you smell a favorite food, and you start to salivate. That's the salivary reflex. So these are the two functional classes of reflex. So now I have a couple of questions. One is dealing with those components and trying to put them in order for a reflex arc, and this is actually the patellar reflex. And the second question has to do with autonomic versus somatic reflexes and being able to identify which type of effector is involved in each, autonomic and somatic.